In the year of our Lord 1347, when winter's cruel hand gripped the realm and desperate souls wandered the king's forests, there lived a man forgotten by God's mercy, or so he believed. Godwin the outcast, branded a thief, and cast from hearth and home, dwelt in shadows deeper than the ancient oaks that sheltered him. Yet within the heart of the most forsaken can burn a flame that illuminates the very heavens themselves. Join us now as we witness how one moment of compassion can transform a soul damned by men into a vessel of divine purpose. See how the sacred and the profane dance together in God's mysterious design, and discover that redemption oft comes wearing the most unexpected garments. The frost-kissed dawn broke reluctantly over the thornwood, casting long shadows between the ancient oaks that had stood sentinel since the time of the conqueror. Godwin crouched beside a fallen log, his breath forming ghostly wisps in the bitter air as he gnawed upon a crust of bread stolen from a merchant's wagon 3 leagues hence. His clothes, once the honest brown wool of a village craftsman, now hung in tatters that spoke of 2 winters spent beneath heaven's harsh gaze. The bells of St. Dunstan's Abbey echoed faintly through the trees, calling the faithful to morning prayers. Godwin's hand moved instinctively to where a wooden cross once hung at his throat. Now only an empty cord remained, the sacred token long since traded for a handful of grain when hunger had driven him beyond the bounds of piety. He spat into the frozen earth, cursing the fate that had cast him from the warmth of Christian fellowship into this wilderness of want. Thief, murderer, devil's spawn. The words still rang in his memory like the tolling of funeral bells. 2 years passed when the merchant Aldrich was found dead upon the King's Road. They had needed a soul to bear the blame. Godwin, with no family to speak for him and no lord to claim his service, had served their purpose well enough. Though the true killer, Aldrich's own nephew, greedy for inheritance, now sat warm by his stolen hearth, none would hear the protests of a common leatherworker against the sworn testimony of merchants and their gold. The forest stirred with the morning's awakening. Somewhere in the distance a horn sounded. The royal hunters were abroad, pursuing the king's deer through the sacred groves, where common men dared not tread upon pain of death. Godwin rose stiffly, joints aching with cold and privation, and melted deeper into the undergrowth. He knew well the sound of noble sport, had learned to read the forest's moods as keenly as once he had known the grain of leather beneath his tools. As he moved through the brambles with the practiced silence of the hunted, his thoughts turned to the village he had once called home. Little Emma, the cooper's daughter, who had smiled so sweetly when he brought her ribbons from the market. Master Edmund, who had taught him the craft of leatherworking with patient hands. Father Benedict, whose sermons had once filled his heart with hope of salvation, all lost now, as distant as the stars that wheeled overhead in their celestial dance. The hunting horns grew closer, accompanied by the baying of hounds and the thunder of hoofbeats upon the forest floor. Godwin pressed himself against the rough bark of an oak, feeling its ancient strength at his back. Through gaps in the foliage, he glimpsed the bright colors of noble garments, scarlet and gold, azure and silver, as the hunting party swept past like a river of earthly power and privilege. Yet, something was amiss. The hounds, instead of following their quarry with ordered purpose, ran in frantic circles, whimpering and pawing at the ground. The huntsmen cursed and shouted, their voices carrying the sharp edge of frustration. One among them, resplendent in a surcoat bearing the golden lions of the realm, raised his horn to his lips and blew a series of sharp blasts, the signal for the hunt to gather. "The beast has gone to ground," called a voice rich with authority. "Sir Geoffrey, take thy men eastward along the stream. Sir Edmund, sweep north toward the Abbeylands. We shall have this stag ere the sun reaches its zenith, or my name is not Lord Aldwin of Thornmere." Godwin's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Lord Aldwin, the very nobleman who had pronounced judgment upon him in the manor court, whose cold eyes had shown no mercy when the false witnesses spoke their poisoned words. The man who had stripped him of name, home, and honor, with a gesture no more significant than swatting a bothersome fly. As the hunting party dispersed into the forest's depths, Godwin remained frozen against the oak's embrace, torn between the instinct to flee and a darker urge to witness whatever fate awaited the pursued creature. Something in the morning's strange atmosphere held him fast, a tension in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks upon the earth. The sound of breaking branches drew his attention eastward, where something large moved through the undergrowth with desperate urgency. Godwin crept forward, curiosity overcoming caution, until he reached a small clearing where ancient stones stood in a circle, one of the old sacred places that had known worship long before Christ's cross came to these shores. There, in the center of the stone circle, stood the most magnificent creature Godwin had ever beheld. A white stag, massive beyond mortal measure, its antlers spreading like the branches of the world tree itself. Its coat shone with an otherworldly radiance that seemed to gather and reflect every ray of sunlight that pierced the forest canopy. But it was the creature's eyes that struck Godwin's soul like a bolt from heaven, ancient, wise, and filled with a sorrow that spoke of all the world's pain. About the stag's powerful legs were wrapped the cruel iron snares of poachers, devices forbidden in the king's forest, set by desperate men who cared nothing for law or custom. The sacred beast had stumbled into this unholy trap, and now stood bleeding and helpless, awaiting either rescue or death. Godwin's heart pounded like a smith's hammer upon the anvil. This was no ordinary deer, but the white stag of St. Dunstan, the legendary creature said to be blessed by the abbey's patron saint himself. The monks spoke of it in hushed reverence, claiming it appeared only in times of great need, carrying God's grace to those who walked in darkness. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered his trance. The hunters were closing in, drawn by some instinct toward their quarry's hiding place. In moments they would break through the undergrowth and find the trapped stag, and Lord Aldwyn would claim the greatest trophy in all the realm, the sacred symbol of the abbey's divine protection. Godwin's hand moved to the eating knife at his belt, a poor tool but sharp enough for a man who knew how to use it. Every fiber of his being screamed warnings. To aid the stag meant certain death if discovered, for poaching the king's deer was a hanging offense, and interfering with noble sport would earn him tortures beyond imagining. Yet, as he looked into those ancient eyes, filled with patient acceptance of whatever fate awaited, something stirred within Godwin's breast that had lain dormant since the day of his exile. Perhaps it was the memory of who he had once been, before the world's cruelty had hardened his heart to stone. Perhaps it was the recognition of a fellow outcast, noble in its essence, yet trapped by circumstances beyond its control. Or perhaps, in that sacred grove where Christian and pagan stones stood together in silent testament to mysteries beyond mortal understanding, the hand of Providence itself reached down to touch a thief's blackened soul with the first gleam of redemption's light. Without conscious thought, Godwin found himself moving toward the trapped stag, his feet carrying him across the threshold of the ancient stone circle as if drawn by invisible threads. The creature regarded him with those timeless eyes, neither flinching nor fleeing, as though it recognized in this ragged outcast some quality that transcended his fallen state. The iron snares had bitten deep into the stag's legs, and blood, bright as rubies, stained the pristine white of its coat. Godwin knelt beside the magnificent beast, marveling at its size and the strange warmth that seemed to emanate from its form despite the morning's bitter cold. Up close, he could see that the antlers were carved with intricate patterns, as though some divine hand had etched sacred symbols into the very bone. "Peace, noble one," Godwin whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "I mean thee no harm." The hunting horn sounded again, closer now, perhaps only a bowshot away. Godwin's hands trembled as he drew his eating knife, its blade worn thin by years of use, but honed to razor sharpness. The snares were cunningly wrought, their loops designed to tighten with every movement of the trapped animal. Blood welled fresh as Godwin began to work the blade beneath the cruel iron, and the stag stood motionless, trusting this unlikely savior with a faith that humbled the thief's cynical heart. "Why do I risk my neck for thee?" Godwin muttered as he sawed at the first snare. "What art thou to me, or I to thee? We are both outcasts here, thou sacred, I profane, yet both of us hunted by those who claim dominion over forest and field." The rope parted with a soft whisper, and the stag's right foreleg was freed. Godwin moved quickly to the second snare, acutely aware of the approaching thunder of hoofbeats. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the cold, and his heart hammered so loudly he feared it might alert the hunters to his presence. As he worked, memories flooded unbidden through his mind. He saw himself as he had been, Godwin the leather worker, whose hands had crafted saddles for knights and harnesses for merchants' horses. He remembered the pride he had taken in his craft, the honest sweat of labor, the respect of his neighbors. He recalled kneeling in St. Dunstan's chapel, receiving the blessed bread from Father Benedict's gentle hands, feeling himself part of the great community of the faithful, all lost now, swept away by the tide of false accusation and noble indifference. Yet here, in this moment of peril, he felt more truly himself than he had in 2 long years of wandering and theft. The second snare parted, then the third. Only one remained, wound tightly about the stag's left hind leg, where the iron had cut deepest. Blood flowed more freely here, and Godwin could see that the creature's strength was beginning to fail. Its breathing had grown labored, and a fine tremor ran through its massive frame. "Hold fast," Godwin urged, working his blade with desperate precision. "Freedom lies but a hair's breadth away." The voices of the hunters grew clear now, cutting through the morning air with the authority of those accustomed to having their will obeyed without question. "The trail leads this way, my lord," called a voice Godwin recognized as Sir Geoffrey's, a knight renowned for his skill in the chase and his cruelty to those who crossed his path. "Then let us press forward," came Lord Aldwin's reply, cold and commanding. "The beast cannot have gone far. These ancient stones have ever been a refuge for creatures great and small. We shall find our quarry cowering among the heathen ruins." Godwin's knife slipped, opening a gash across his palm that sent blood streaming down to mingle with the stag's. As the crimson drops fell upon the creature's white coat, something extraordinary occurred. The stag turned its great head to look directly into Godwin's eyes. And in that gaze, the thief saw not just animal intelligence but something far deeper, a recognition, an acknowledgement, a blessing that seemed to flow from the very heart of creation itself. The final snare parted with a sound like a harp string breaking. The white stag was free. For a moment that stretched like eternity, man and beast regarded each other in perfect silence. Then the stag lowered its magnificent head in what could only be interpreted as a bow, a gesture of gratitude that struck Godwin's soul like lightning from a clear sky. When it raised its head again, those ancient eyes seemed to hold a promise, though of what nature the thief could not say. The sound of breaking branches announced the hunter's imminent arrival. Without hesitation, Godwin threw himself toward a cluster of brambles at the clearing's edge, burrowing deep into their thorny embrace, just as the first of the mounted nobles burst into the stone circle. "By all the saints!" Sir Geoffrey's voice rang with amazement. "Look there, the white stag itself!" Through the gaps in his thorny refuge, Godwin watched as the hunting party spread around the circle's perimeter. Lord Aldwin sat his destrier in the very spot where moments before the snares had held their sacred prisoner, his eyes blazing with the fervor of the true hunter faced with the ultimate prize. "'Tis the creature of legend," breathed another knight, his voice hushed with awe. "The sacred stag of St. Dunstan, which appears only when God's grace moves upon the earth." "Legend or no," Lord Aldwin declared, raising his hunting bow, "it shall grace my hall ere this day is done. Never has mortal man taken such a trophy. The poet shall sing of this hunt for 1,000 years." The stag stood motionless in the circle's center, magnificent and serene, showing no sign of the wounds that had so recently bound it. Indeed, as Godwin watched in wonder, he could see that the creature's injuries had begun to heal with supernatural swiftness, the bleeding already stemmed and the torn flesh knitting itself closed. Lord Aldwin drew back his bowstring, the arrow's steel point gleaming in the dappled sunlight. Every eye was fixed upon the white stag, every breath held in anticipation of the shot that would claim the greatest prize in all the king's forests. But the stag did not flee. Instead, it turned its gaze directly upon Lord Aldwin, and in that exchange of looks, something passed between hunter and hunted that transformed the very nature of the moment. The nobleman's hands began to tremble, his arrow wavering from its mark as those ancient eyes seemed to peer into the deepest recesses of his soul. "My lord?" Sir Geoffrey ventured, puzzled by his master's sudden hesitation. "The shot is clear. Why do you not loose?" Lord Aldwin's bow arm shook more violently, and the arrow tumbled from his nerveless fingers to clatter among the ancient stones. His face had gone pale as fresh snow, and when he spoke his voice carried a tremor that his men had never heard before. I cannot," he whispered. "Those eyes, they know me. They see all that I have done, all that I am. How can mortal man loose shaft at such a creature? 'Tis no mere beast, but some messenger of the Almighty, come to judge the quick and the dead." The other hunters exchanged glances of bewilderment. Never had they seen their lord show weakness in the face of any quarry, yet here he sat trembling like a child before the white stag's patient gaze. And in that moment of divine intervention, the stag made its choice. With movements fluid as flowing water, it bounded toward the circle's eastern edge, where the forest grew thickest and the abbey's bells could be heard most clearly. Not in panic or desperation, but with the dignity of a king withdrawing from court, it departed the clearing and vanished into the green depths of thornwood. The hunting party sat their horses in stunned silence, watching the empty space where moments before the legendary creature had stood. Only the trampled earth and a few drops of sacred blood upon the ancient stones bore witness to what had transpired in this hallowed grove. Hidden in his bower of thorns, Godwin felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, the first he had shed since the day of his exile. He had witnessed something beyond mortal understanding, had played a part in a mystery that would echo through the ages. The white stag lived and ran free because a thief had chosen mercy over safety, compassion over self-preservation. Yet even as wonder filled his heart, Godwin knew that his greatest trial still lay ahead. For Lord Aldwin would not return empty-handed from this hunt, and someone would surely bear the blame for the loss of such a prize. The return to Thornmere Castle was a journey wreathed in silence and shadow. Lord Aldwin rode at the column's head, his face a mask of stone that revealed nothing of the tumult raging within his breast. Behind him, his knights and huntsmen followed in subdued procession, none daring to speak of what they had witnessed in the sacred grove. The castle bells were tolling vespers when the hunting party clattered across the drawbridge into the great courtyard. Servants and stable boys rushed forward to tend the horses, their eager faces falling when they saw no proud trophy strapped across any saddle. Word of the hunt's failure spread through the castle like wildfire. The white stag had been found, yet lived still to roam the king's forests. In the great hall, beneath the painted eyes of a dozen generations of Thornmere lords, Aldwin sat brooding in his carved chair, while servants kindled the evening fires. The sacred creature's gaze haunted him still, those ancient eyes that had seemed to pierce the very fabric of his soul. What had he seen reflected there? What judgment had passed in that moment, when his arrow should have flown true? "My lord," ventured Sir Geoffrey, approaching with cautious steps, "perhaps we might organize another hunt on the morrow? The stag cannot have gone far, and with fresh hounds—" "Nay." Aldwin's voice cut through the hall like a blade through silk. "There will be no more hunting of the white stag. What we witnessed today was beyond the natural order of things. I'll not tempt Providence further by pursuing such a creature." Sir Geoffrey's brow furrowed in confusion. "But my lord, 'twas the greatest prize in all the realm. Surely nothing." Aldwin rose from his chair, pacing to the great hearth where flames danced among the logs. "Think you I have not pondered every moment of this day? The beast stood trapped, helpless, yet when I would have taken its life, something stayed my hand, some power greater than mortal will." The truth was deeper than Aldwin dared speak aloud. In the stag's eyes he had seen not judgment, but recognition, as though the creature knew him for what he truly was. Every injustice he had perpetrated, every harsh sentence he had pronounced, every moment when mercy might have tempered justice but did not, all laid bare before that eternal gaze. Most haunting of all was the memory of Godwin the leather worker, condemned on false testimony while the true killer walked free. Aldwin had known or suspected the truth even then, but the merchant's gold had spoken louder than a poor craftsman's protestations. Now that act of willful blindness seemed to burn upon his conscience like a brand pressed into living flesh. As these dark thoughts consumed him, a commotion arose in the courtyard below. Torches flickered through the arrow slits, and voices called out in urgency. Sir Geoffrey strode to the nearest window, peering down into the gathering darkness. "My lord," he called, his voice tight with concern. "Father Marcus approaches from the abbey, and he bears the banner of parley. It appears some matter of great import drives him forth at this late hour." Aldwin felt a chill that had naught to do with the evening air. Father Marcus was the Abbey of St. Dunstan's most senior priest after the abbot himself, a man of learning and discretion who would not venture forth without gravest cause. Minutes later, the priest was ushered into the great hall, his brown habit mud-spattered from hard riding. He was a man of middle years, with the pale complexion of one who spent his days among books and prayers, yet his eyes burned with an inner fire that spoke of divine purpose. "My Lord Aldwin," Father Marcus began without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of one who spoke for Mother Church herself, "I come bearing tidings that will shake the very foundations of thy understanding. This day, in the sacred grove where stands the circle of St. Dunstan, a miracle has occurred that demands thy attention." Aldwin's blood turned to ice water in his veins. "A miracle, good father? Pray elaborate." "The white stag, the blessed creature that serves as symbol of our abbey's divine protection, was discovered this evening in our chapel, kneeling before the altar of St. Dunstan himself. Its coat bore traces of blood, and about its legs were the marks of iron snares. Yet these wounds were healing with supernatural swiftness, and the beast showed no fear of mortal presence." The priest paused, his gaze never wavering from Aldwin's pale face. "But this is not the greatest wonder, my lord. Upon the creature's white coat, mingled with its sacred blood, were drops of human gore. Blood shed in mercy, not malice. The stag has been freed from cruel bondage by one whose heart, though fallen, still beats with compassion." Sir Geoffrey stepped forward, his hand resting upon his sword hilt. "Father, surely you do not accuse Lord Aldwin of—" "Peace, Sir Geoffrey," Aldwin commanded, though his voice trembled like autumn leaves. "Let the good father speak his piece." Father Marcus nodded gravely. "The Holy Brothers have spent this evening in prayer and contemplation, seeking to understand the meaning of these signs. Brother Thomas, our most learned scholar, discovered references in the Abbey's oldest texts, chronicles dating to the time of St. Dunstan himself. From within his habit, the priest withdrew a leather-bound manuscript, its pages yellow with age. It is written here that the white stag appears not as quarry for the hunt, but as harbinger of divine justice. When innocent blood cries out for vengeance, the sacred creature manifests to guide truth into the light of day." Aldwin's legs nearly gave way beneath him. He grasped the back of his chair for support, feeling as though the very earth shifted beneath his feet. What does this portend, Father?" "The stag bears witness to a great injustice, my lord. Someone innocent suffers wrongly, while the guilty walks free in the shadow of false testimony. Until this wrong is righted, the creature will continue to appear, carrying its message of divine displeasure." The hall fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the whisper of wind through the arrow slits. Every soul present felt the weight of cosmic judgment settling upon them like a shroud. "Moreover," Father Marcus continued relentlessly, "the beast showed no fear when Brother Thomas approached to examine its wounds. Indeed, it seemed to recognize him, as though acknowledging a servant of the same God who sent it forth. But most wondrous of all, when the good brother placed his hand upon the creature's brow to offer blessing, visions came to him of the one whose blood mingled with the stag's sacred gore." Aldwin's throat had gone dry as parchment. "Visions?" "Aye, my lord. Brother Thomas beheld a man cast out from Christian fellowship, living as an outcast in the king's forests. A soul condemned for crimes he did not commit, yet one whose heart retained enough grace to show mercy to God's creation, even at risk of his own life. The Almighty has marked this man, though he knows it not." The priest closed the ancient book with a sound like thunder in the silent hall. "My lord, I come not as accuser, but as herald of God's justice. The truth that has long lain buried will rise to light, for the white stag of St. Dunstan has been freed by hands made sacred through suffering. What say you to these tidings?" Lord Aldwin stood frozen in the crossroads of his conscience, feeling the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. The merchant's gold seemed to burn in his treasury, bought with an innocent man's freedom. The comfortable lies he had told himself crumbled like parchment in flame. Somewhere in the darkness beyond his castle walls, Godwin the outcast huddled in whatever poor shelter he had found, unaware that his single act of mercy had set in motion forces that would transform not just his own fate, but the very nature of justice in the realm. The white stag had delivered its message. Now came the time for mortal souls to choose between the easy path of continued deception and the harder road that led toward redemption. In the great hall of Thornmere Castle, beneath the watchful eyes of carved ancestors and painted saints, Lord Aldwin faced the greatest decision of his earthly existence. 3 days passed in the grip of an unseasonable storm that seemed to mirror the tempest raging within Lord Aldwin's soul. The wind howled through the castle walls like the voices of the wrongfully condemned, and sleep fled from his chamber as though banished by divine decree. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw those ancient orbs of the white stag, patient and knowing, stripping away every pretense until only naked truth remained. On the fourth morning, when dawn broke clear and cold over the frost-silvered landscape, Aldwyn could bear the burden no longer. He rose from his sleepless bed and summoned Sir Geoffrey to his private chamber, where maps of his holdings covered the walls like accusations waiting to be answered. "Geoffrey," he began, his voice hoarse with inner struggle, "I would have thee gather a company of men, not for the hunt, but for a different manner of seeking. There is a wrong that must be righted, a debt of justice that cries out from the very stones of this realm." Sir Geoffrey's weathered face creased with concern. "My lord, what manner of seeking? You have spoken strangely these past days, and the servants whisper—" "Let them whisper," Aldwyn interrupted, moving to the window that overlooked the forest where his life had changed forever. "I care not for servants' prattle when immortal souls hang in the balance. We seek Godwyn the leather worker, called Godwyn the Outcast, who was banished from his village on charges of murder and theft." The knight's expression grew troubled. "My lord, surely you do not mean to recall—" "I mean to discover truth, Geoffrey. The white stag's message burns within my breast like a coal from heaven's own fire. If divine providence itself declares this man's innocence, who am I to gainsay the Almighty's will?" Sir Geoffrey bowed his head, though uncertainty clouded his features. "As you command, my lord. How many men shall I gather for this seeking? 12 should suffice, but choose them well. We hunt not for sport, but for justice, and I would have only those whose hearts can distinguish between the two." Aldwyn turned from the window, and Sir Geoffrey was struck by the change in his master's countenance. Where once had been the hard certainty of noble privilege, now flickered something softer yet stronger. The light of conscience awakened. Within the hour, the search party rode forth from Thornmere Castle, their horses' breath steaming in the crisp air as they entered the deep woods, where desperate souls sought refuge from the world's harsh judgment. Aldwyn rode at their head, no longer the proud hunter, but a man bent beneath the weight of approaching redemption. They found Godwyn as the sun reached its zenith, huddled in a crude shelter of branches and bracken beside a frozen stream. The past days of storm had been cruel to one with no hearth to warm him, and he lay shivering beneath a threadbare cloak, his face gaunt with hunger and exposure. "Godwyn of Millbrook," Aldwyn called softly as he dismounted, approaching the wretched figure with steps made heavy by shame. "I would speak with thee." The outcast's eyes flew open, and terror etched deep lines across his weathered features. He scrambled backward like a wounded animal, pressing himself against the trunk of an ancient oak. "My lord," Godwyn gasped, his voice barely a whisper, "I have taken naught from thy lands this day. I swear it upon my mother's grave. If some crime has been laid at my door—" "Peace," Aldwyn said, raising his hand in a gesture that was part command, part benediction. "I come not as accuser, but as seeker of truth. Tell me, Godwyn, what know you of the white stag that roams these forests?" Confusion replaced terror in the outcast's eyes. The sacred stag of St. Dunstan? My lord, I am but a condemned thief. What would such as I know of holy matters?" Aldwyn knelt in the frost-brittle grass, bringing himself to the same level as the man he had wronged so grievously. Behind him, his knights exchanged glances of amazement. Never had they seen their lord humble himself thus before any soul, noble or common. 3 days passed, Aldwyn continued, his voice growing stronger. "I hunted the white stag in the ancient grove where the old stones stand. We found the creature trapped in poachers' snares, yet when we arrived, it stood free and unbound. Father Marcus tells me that human blood mingled with the stag's sacred gore, blood shed in mercy, not malice." Godwyn's face had gone pale as winter morning, but he remained silent. "The Holy Brothers speak of visions," Aldwyn pressed on. "They tell of one cast out from Christian fellowship, who yet retained grace enough to show compassion to God's creation. They speak of blood-bought redemption and divine justice crying out from sacred wounds." Still Godwyn said nothing, but his hand moved unconsciously to palm the knife cut that had mingled his life's essence with that of the blessed creature. The wound had healed with supernatural swiftness, leaving only a thin white line that seemed to catch the light like silver thread. "I know it was thee," Aldwyn said finally, his voice breaking with the weight of confession. As surely as I know my own sins have come home to roost. Thou freed the sacred stag, and in so doing, thou hast freed something within mine own soul that I had thought long dead." He reached within his surcoat and withdrew a leather purse heavy with gold, the very coins the merchants had paid for false witness. "This blood money burns my hands like fire from hell's own forge. But worse than the gold is the knowledge of what I permitted in my court that black day 2 years past." Godwin's eyes widened as understanding began to dawn. "My lord, I know not what." "Thou knowest full well," Aldwin interrupted, and now tears flowed freely down his noble cheeks. "I sat in judgment, while merchants bought thy condemnation with their cursed gold. I knew or suspected that young Edmund slew his uncle for inheritance, yet I chose the easy path of ignorance over the harder road of justice." The wind sighed through the bare branches overhead, carrying with it the distant sound of abbey bells calling the faithful to prayer. In that holy music, both men heard an echo of the greater harmony that bound all creation in divine purpose. "But Providence moves in ways beyond mortal understanding," Aldwin continued. "The white stag, messenger of St. Dunstan himself, has borne witness to thy innocence, not through thy words, which I was too proud to hear, but through thy deeds, which speak louder than any testimony." He held forth the purse of gold, though his hands trembled with the magnitude of the gesture. "This is but a poor beginning of the recompense thou art owed. Thy name shall be cleared, thy honor restored, and those who bore false witness shall face the justice they sought to deny thee." Godwin stared at the offered gold as though it were a serpent poised to strike. "My lord, I cannot, after what I have become, what I have done to survive." "What thou hast done," Aldwin said firmly, "is show mercy when mercy was not deserved, compassion when compassion brought only peril. The white stag chose thee as its champion, not despite thy fallen state, but because within that brokenness burned a flame that all the world's cruelty could not extinguish." Sir Geoffrey stepped forward, his weathered face creased with wonder. "My lord speaks truly, Godwin. I was there in the grove when the creature gazed upon us all. Never have I felt such weight of judgment, such certainty that divine eyes looked upon mortal souls and found them wanting. Yet that same power that condemned has now chosen to redeem." Slowly, trembling like a man in fever, Godwin reached forth to accept the purse. As his fingers closed upon the leather, warm despite the morning's chill, he felt something stir within his breast that had lain dormant since the day of his exile. Not merely hope, but the deeper certainty that his suffering had served a purpose beyond his understanding. "What would my lord have of me?" he asked, his voice gaining strength with each word. Aldwin rose and extended his hand to raise the outcast from the frozen earth. "First, that thou shouldst come with us to Thornmere Castle, where thou shalt be bathed, clothed and fed as befits a man whom God himself has vindicated. Then, if thou art willing, I would have thee take service in my household, not as servant, but as counselor in matters of justice." "My lord," Godwin protested, overwhelmed by the magnitude of such grace, "I am unworthy of such trust." "Nay," Aldwin replied, his voice ringing with newfound certainty, "thou art the most worthy soul I know, for thou hast walked through the valley of the shadow and emerged with thy humanity intact. Who better to counsel justice than one who has suffered injustice? Who better to speak for the innocent than one whom the guilty sought to destroy?" As they prepared to depart that place of revelation, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the forest. From the direction of the abbey came a small procession, Father Marcus and 3 of his brother monks riding with the urgency of men bearing momentous news. "My lord Aldwin," Father Marcus called as he drew near, his face flushed with excitement and divine purpose. "Providence has guided our steps to this very place, for we bear tidings that complete the circle of God's justice." The priest dismounted with surprising agility for one accustomed to cloistered life, and approached the group with eyes that blazed with righteous fire. "Brother Thomas has received another vision, clearer than the first. The Almighty has revealed not only the innocent man's identity, but the true perpetrator of the crime that stained these lands with injustice." Godwin felt his knees grow weak, and Sir Geoffrey moved to steady him with a gentle hand. After 2 years of bearing another man's guilt, the moment of complete vindication seemed too vast to comprehend. "Speak, good father," Aldwin commanded, though his voice trembled with anticipation. "Young Edmund, nephew to the slain merchant Aldrich, has been struck down by fever in his stolen prosperity, Father Marcus declared. In his delirium, he cries out confessions that freeze the blood of all who hear them. His servants came to the abbey this very morning, begging us to shrive a soul tormented by murder most foul. The priest turned to Godwin with eyes full of compassion. He speaks thy name repeatedly, good Godwin, begging forgiveness from one he helped to destroy. The weight of his uncle's blood and thy suffering has broken his mind completely. God's justice, though slow to manifest, strikes with precision divine. And what of the merchants who bore false witness? Sir Geoffrey inquired, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. Already fled, Father Marcus replied with grim satisfaction. When word spread of Edmund's ravings, they took ship in the night, carrying their ill-gotten gains to whatever distant shore will harbour them. But their flight speaks as clearly as any confession. The righteous know no need to run from justice. Lord Aldwin stood in the centre of this divine drama, feeling the full weight of Providence's design settling upon his shoulders. Every element of the wrong he had permitted was being systematically unravelled by forces beyond mortal power, guided by a white stag whose sacred mission had transformed them all. "Then it is finished," he said softly, placing his hand upon Godwin's shoulder in a gesture that acknowledged not superiority, but brotherhood. "The truth stands revealed, innocence vindicated, and justice, though long delayed, finally served." "Nay, my lord," Godwin replied, and his voice carried a strength that had been tempered in suffering's forge. "It is not finished, but begun anew. For what profit is there in personal vindication if the system that condemned me remains unchanged? How many other innocents languish in exile or hang from gibbet's tree, while truth lies buried beneath gold and influence?" Father Marcus smiled with the joy of one who witnesses divine grace working through mortal instruments. "Spoken like a true servant of justice, my son. The white stag chose its champion well." Aldwin's eyes kindled with understanding. "Then let this be the foundation of a new covenant, not merely between lord and vassal, but between all who seek truth in a world too often ruled by expedience. Let Thornmere become a place where justice flows like clear water, unpolluted by the corruption of wealth or privilege. I shall help thee build such a place," Godwin declared, his voice ringing with purpose born of suffering transformed. "For I have learned in exile's bitter school that mercy and justice are not enemies but twin aspects of divine love. Let us create a court where the powerless need not fear the powerful, where truth is more precious than gold." As the company prepared to return to Thornmere Castle, the sound of movement in the nearby undergrowth drew their attention. From between the ancient oaks stepped the white stag itself, magnificent in the dappled sunlight, its coat gleaming with otherworldly radiance. Upon its legs, no trace remained of the cruel snares that had once bound it. The wounds had healed without scar, testament to the power that flowed through sacred veins. The creature approached Godwin with steps measured and stately, showing no fear of the assembled men. When it reached the redeemed outcast, it lowered its great head in the same gesture of recognition that had blessed him in the stone circle days before. Godwin reached forth with trembling hands to touch the velvet muzzle, and as flesh met sacred flesh, a warmth spread through his being that banished the last shadows of his long winter of exile. In the stag's ancient eyes, he saw reflected not his past failures, but his future purpose, to stand as guardian of justice for all who had no voice to speak in their own defense. "Go in peace, noble one," Godwin whispered. "Thy mission is accomplished, thy message delivered. We who remain shall strive to prove worthy of the grace thou hast shown us." The white stag raised its head and gazed upon each man present, as though blessing them for the work that lay ahead. Then, with movements fluid as flowing water, it turned and bounded into the forest depths, disappearing among the trees like a vision of divine love made manifest in mortal flesh.